Hello and welcome to It's Your Business on Megapix Media with Mario Toneguzzi. Joining me today is Rebecca Oates, who is AVP of Advanced Analytics for Equifax Canada. Thanks for joining us today, Rebecca.
Hi, nice to be here.
Let me just start with some numbers that Equifax Canada just recently released. We've crossed over $2 trillion in consumer debt in Canada in the third quarter. 3.8% increase from a year ago. The average consumer debt is 74,897, up 3.3% from a year ago. Should we be alarmed by those figures?
So I think if you think about it in two parts, we obviously have a mortgage element to those numbers. So this 2 trillion includes mortgages. Now mortgages we know have been increasing in terms of house prices for quite some time. So a large chunk of that 2 trillion is related to mortgage. So we kind of expect that to be increasing ongoing. We have new people coming to Canada every year. So that does typically tend to increase. In terms of on the non-mortgage side, we did see some big drops in terms of non-mortgage debt in Q2, which was due to the pandemic primarily. That has started to increase again during Q3. Now it's not an alarming rate, it's kind of pretty typical in terms of what we expect to see increase-wise, with a few exceptions like auto loans, which are particularly high this quarter, but it's certainly nothing to be too alarmed about right now. It's fairly typical growth that we're seeing.
Okay, then what is fueling the growth on the non-mortgage side? Like what kind of things are we seeing people, raising their credit for?
So auto loans has been the one where we've seen the biggest increase this quarter. Now, some of that's likely going to be due to people just catching up. So obviously during the lockdowns that we had from kind of March to June time, consumers weren't going out and doing what they would typically do. So there are going to be consumers that were wanting to purchase new vehicles or change their vehicles, and that didn't happen. So we are seeing some catch up on the auto loan side in particular. Credit card spend is starting to increase, so that's the other thing that we are starting to see increase again. Again, that was very low from March to June, just again resultant to people not going out, not going to restaurants, not necessarily buying that vacation or on a credit card. So that is starting to increase, but we're also seeing the average payment on credit cards increase as well. So that's kind of balancing itself out at the moment. So auto loans is kind of the biggest movement we've seen in terms of unusual growth. But again, that might be partly due to that catch up as people are starting to go and change their vehicles.
Okay, tell me what you're seeing, Rebecca, in terms of delinquency rates across the country.
So delinquency rates is a really interesting one. So the numbers that we typically quote are what we call 90-day delinquency rates. So this is kind of a measure that is trying to represent quite severe financial stress. So this is where a trade, an account hasn't been paid for 90 days or more. Now those levels are pretty much at an all-time low. So we're seeing those really drop off, particularly in this quarter. Now that's partly to do with some of the support mechanisms that are in place. So some of the payment deferrals, we've seen over 3 million consumers leverage a payment deferral at some point since the pandemic started. They are reported to us in such a way that it appears current up to date, and that there is no payment due at this time. So temporarily, those numbers are going to be frozen almost as current while those deferral programs are active. So it is at a low right now, but that's again partly because we're not seeing it start to come through yet. So as those deferral programs start to end, we highly expect to see some of the consumers who perhaps are more stressed during this period start to miss some payments. And that is one thing that we've been looking at this quarter, is what's going on with early stage delinquency. So this is where a consumer perhaps hasn't paid for 1 month or 2 months. And we're starting to see that creep back up again. It's still not as high as it was prior to COVID, but again, we still have a lot of active deferral programs in place. But that is something we're watching, because on credit cards in particular, we're starting to see that edge back up.
Now, when you look at the delinquency rates, Rebecca, across the country, are there any particular regions of the country that are more concerning right now than others?
So the West has been one that we've been looking at for quite some time. So, Alberta in particular, prior to COVID, we'd seen delinquency levels were already starting to increase. Now, some of that is kind of very industry based. So obviously we have the oil prices fluctuating, that can do some interesting things in terms of delinquency levels. So that was increasing prior to COVID. So we're still closely watching that. Again, there isn't really anything yet coming through, just because it's a little bit harder to see exactly where some of that stress might be right now, because of the deferral programs hiding some of it to an extent. But the West is always one that we're going to be constantly watching, just because obviously it does have its own kind of microenvironment due to the oil industry there.
Yeah, okay, super. Well, thanks very much for joining us today, Rebecca.
Thank you so much.
Okay, that was Rebecca Oates, AVP of Advanced Analytics for Equifax Canada. This has been It's Your Business with Mario Toneguzzi on Megapix Media. Thanks for joining us today.